It gives to the wearer a singularly piquant and alluring aspect. One of these waitresses, a woman of 40, had side whiskers reaching halfway down her jaw. They were 2 fingers broad, dark in color, pretty thick, and the hairs were an inch long. One sees many women on the continent with quite conspicuous mustaches, but this was the only woman I saw who had reached the dignity of whiskers. After dinner, the guests of both sexes distributed themselves about the front porches and the ornamental grounds belonging to the hotel to enjoy the cool air. But as the twilight deepened towards darkness, they gathered themselves together in that saddest and solemnest and most constrained of all places, the great blank drawing-room, which is a chief feature of all continental summer hotels. There they grouped themselves about in couples and threes, and mumbled in bated voices, and looked timid and homeless and forlorn. There was a small piano in this room, a clattery, wheezy, asthmatic thing, certainly the very worst miscarriage in the way of a piano that the world has seen. In turn, 5 or 6 dejected and homesick ladies approached it doubtingly, gave it a single inquiring thump, and retired with the lockjaw. But the boss of that instrument was to come, nevertheless, and from my own country, from Arkansas. She was a brand-new bride, innocent, girlish, happy in herself and her grave and worshipping stripling of a husband. She was about 18, just out of school, free from affectations, unconscious of that passionless multitude around her, and the very first time she smote that old wreck, one recognized that it had met its destiny. Her stripling brought an armful of aged sheet music from their room, for this bride went heeled, as you might say, and bent himself lovingly over and got ready to turn the pages. The bride fetched a swoop with her fingers from one end of the keyboard to the other, just to get her bearings, as it were, and you could see the congregation set their teeth with the agony of it. Then, without any more preliminaries, she turned on all the horrors of the Battle of Prague, that venerable charivari, and waded chin-deep in the blood of the slain. She made a fair and honorable average of 2 false notes in every 5, but her soul was in arms, and she never stopped to correct. The audience stood it with pretty fair grit for a while, but when the cannonade waxed hotter and fiercer, and the discord average rose to 4 in 5, the procession began to move. A few stragglers held their ground 10 minutes longer, but when the girl began to wring the true inwardness out of the cries of the wounded, they struck their colors and retired in a kind of panic. There never was a completer victory. I was the only non-combatant left on the field. I would not have deserted my countrywoman anyhow, but indeed I had no desires in that direction. None of us like mediocrity, but we all reverence perfection. This girl's music was perfection in its way. It was the worst music that had ever been achieved on our planet by a mere human being. I moved up close and never lost a strain. When she got through, I asked her to play it again. She did it with a pleased alacrity and a heightened enthusiasm. She made it all discords this time. She got an amount of anguish into the cries of the wounded that shed a new light on human suffering. She was on the warpath all the evening. All the time crowds of people gathered on the porches and pressed their noses against the windows to look and marvel, but the bravest never ventured in. The bride went off satisfied and happy with her young fellow when her appetite was finally gorged, and the tourists swarmed in again. What a change has come over Switzerland, and, in fact, all Europe during this century. 70 or 80 years ago, Napoleon was the only man in Europe who could really be called a traveler. He was the only man who had devoted his attention to it and taken a powerful interest in it. He was the only man who had traveled extensively. But now everybody goes everywhere. and Switzerland, and many other regions which were unvisited and unknown remotenesses 100 years ago, are in our days a buzzing hive of restless strangers every summer. But I digress. In the morning, when we looked out of our windows, we saw a wonderful sight. Across the valley, and apparently quite neighborly and close at hand, the giant form of the Jungfrau rose, cold and white, into the clear sky, beyond a gateway in the nearer highlands. It reminded me somehow of one of those colossal billows which swell suddenly up beside one's ship at sea sometimes, with its crest and shoulders snowy white, and the rest of its noble proportions streaked downward with creamy foam. It was hard to believe that the lofty wooded rampart on the left, which so overtops the Jungfrau, was not actually the higher of the two, but it was not, of course. It is only 2,000 or 3,000 feet high, and of course has no snow upon it in summer, whereas the Jungfrau is not much short of 14,000 feet high, and therefore that lowest verge of snow on her side, which seems nearly down to the valley level, is really about 7,000 feet higher up in the air than the summit of that wooded rampart. It is the distance that makes the deception. The wooded height is but 4 or 5 miles removed from us, but the Jungfrau is 4 or 5 times that distance away. Walking down the street of shops in the forenoon, I was attracted by a large picture, carved, frame and all, from a single block of chocolate-colored wood. There are people who know everything. Some of these had told us that continental shopkeepers always raise their prices on English and Americans. Many people had told us it was expensive to buy things through a courier, whereas I had supposed it was just the reverse. When I saw this picture, I conjectured that it was worth more than the friend I proposed to buy it for would like to pay. But still it was worthwhile to inquire, so I told the courier to step in and ask the price, as if he wanted it for himself. I told him not to speak in English, and above all, not to reveal the fact that he was a courier. Then I moved on a few yards and waited. The courier came presently and reported the price. I said to myself, it is 100 francs too much, and so dismissed the matter from my mind. But in the afternoon I was passing that place with Harris, and the picture attracted me again. We stopped in to see how much higher broken German would raise the price. The shopwoman named a figure just 100 francs lower than the courier had named. This was a pleasant surprise. I said I would take it. After I had given directions as to where it was to be shipped, the shopwoman said appealingly, "If you please, do not let your courier know you bought it." This was an unexpected remark. I said, "What makes you think I have a courier?" "Ah, that is very simple. He told me himself." He was very thoughtful. "But tell me, why did you charge him more than you are charging me?" "That is very simple also. I do not have to pay you a percentage." "Oh, I begin to see. You would have had to pay the courier a percentage." "Undoubtedly. The courier always has his percentage." "In this case it would have been 100 francs. "Then the tradesman does not pay a part of it. The purchaser pays all of it." "There are occasions when the tradesman and the courier agree upon a price which is twice or thrice the value of the article. Then the two divide, and both get a percentage." "I see. But it seems to me that the purchaser does all the paying, even then." "Oh, to be sure. It goes without saying." "But I have bought this picture myself. Therefore, why shouldn't the courier know it?" The woman exclaimed in distress, "Ah, indeed, it would take all my little profit. He would come and demand his 100 francs, and I should have to pay." "He has not done the buying. You could refuse." "I could not dare to refuse. He would never bring travelers here again. More than that, he would denounce me to the other couriers. They would divert custom from me, and my business would be injured." I went away in a thoughtful frame of mind. I began to see why a courier could afford to work for $55 a month and his fares. A month or two later, I was able to understand why a courier did not have to pay any board and lodging. and why my hotel bills were always larger when I had him with me than when I left him behind somewhere for a few days. Another thing was also explained now, apparently. In one town, I had taken the courier to the bank to do the translating when I drew some money. I had sat in the reading room till the transaction was finished. Then a clerk had brought the money to me in person, and had been exceedingly polite, even going so far as to precede me to the door and hold it open for me, and bow me out as if I had been a distinguished personage. It was a new experience. Exchange had been in my favor ever since I had been in Europe, but just that one time. I got simply the face of my draft and no extra francs, whereas I had expected to get quite a number of them. This was the first time I had ever used the courier at a bank. I had suspected something then, and as long as he remained with me afterwards, I managed bank matters by myself. Still, if I felt that I could afford the tax, I would never travel without a courier, for a good courier is a convenience whose value cannot be estimated in dollars and cents. Without him, travel is a bitter harassment, a purgatory of little exasperating annoyances, a ceaseless and pitiless punishment. I mean, to an irascible man who has no business capacity and is confused by details. Without a courier, travel hasn't a ray of pleasure in it anywhere. But with him it is a continuous and unruffled delight. He is always at hand, never has to be sent for. If your bell is not answered promptly, and it seldom is, you have only to open the door and speak. The courier will hear, and he will have the order attended to, or raise an insurrection. You tell him what day you will start and whither you are going. Leave all the rest to him. You need not inquire about trains, or fares, or car changes, or hotels, or anything else. At the proper time, he will put you in a cab or an omnibus and drive you to the train or the boat. He has packed your luggage and transferred it. He has paid all the bills. Other people have preceded you half an hour to scramble for impossible places and lose their tempers, but you can take your time. The courier has secured your seats for you, and you can occupy them at your leisure. At the station, the crowd mash one another to pulp in the effort to get the weighers' attention to their trunks. They dispute hotly with these tyrants who are cool and indifferent. They get their baggage billets at last, and then have another squeeze and another rage over the disheartening business of trying to get them recorded and paid for, and still another over the equally disheartening business of trying to get near enough to the ticket office to buy a ticket. And now, with their tempers gone to the dogs, they must stand penned up and packed together, laden with wraps and satchels and shawl straps, with the weary wife and babies in the waiting room, till the doors are thrown open, and then all hands make a grand final rush to the train, find it full, and have to stand on the platform and fret until some more cars are put on. They are in a condition to kill somebody by this time. Meanwhile, you have been sitting in your car, smoking, and observing all this misery in the extremest comfort. On the journey, the guard is polite and watchful, won't allow anybody to get into your compartment, tells them you are just recovering from the smallpox and do not like to be disturbed. For the courier has made everything right with the guard. At way stations, the courier comes to your compartment to see if you want a glass of water or a newspaper or anything. At eating stations, he sends luncheon out to you while the other people scramble and worry in the dining rooms. If anything breaks about the car you are in, and the station master proposes to pack you and your agent into a compartment with strangers, the courier reveals to him confidently that you are a French duke, born deaf and dumb, and the official comes and makes affable signs that he has ordered a choice car to be added to the train for you. At custom houses, the multitude file tediously through, hot and irritated, and look on while the officers burrow into the trunks and make a mess of everything. But you hand your keys to the courier and sit still. Perhaps you arrive at your destination in a rainstorm at 10 at night. You generally do. The multitude spend half an hour verifying their baggage and getting it transferred to the omnibuses, but the courier puts you into a vehicle without a moment's loss of time, and when you reach your hotel, you find your rooms have been secured 2 or 3 days in advance. Everything is ready. You can go at once to bed. Some of those other people will have to drift around to 2 or 3 hotels in the rain before they find accommodations. I have not set down half of the virtues that are vested in a good courier, but I think I have set down a sufficiency of them to show that an irritable man who can afford one and does not employ him is not a wise economist. My courier was the worst one in Europe, yet he was a good deal better than none at all. It could not pay him to be a better one than he was, because I could not afford to buy things through him. He was a good enough courier for the small amount he got out of his service, yet to travel with a courier is bliss. To travel without one is the reverse. I have had dealings with some very bad couriers, but I have also had dealings with one who might fairly be called perfection. He was a young Polander named Joseph N. Veri. He spoke 8 languages and seemed to be equally at home in all of them. He was shrewd, prompt, posted, and punctual. He was fertile in resources and singularly gifted in the matter of overcoming difficulties. He not only knew how to do everything in his line, but he knew the best ways and the quickest. He was handy with children and invalids. All his employer needed to do was to take life easy and leave everything to the courier. His address is care of Mr. O.H. Kygill, 371 Strand, London. Excellent couriers are somewhat rare. If the reader is about to travel, he will find it to his advantage to make a note of this one. Chapter 33. The beautiful Giesbach Fall is near Interlaken on the other side of the Lake of Brienz, and is illuminated every night with those gorgeous theatrical fires, whose name I cannot call just at this moment. This is said to be a spectacle which the tourist ought by no means to miss. I was strongly tempted, but I could not go there with propriety because one goes in a boat. The task which I had set myself was to walk over Europe on foot, not skim over it in a boat. I had made a tacit contract with myself. It was my duty to abide by it. I was willing to make boat trips for pleasure, but I could not conscientiously make them in the way of business. It cost me something of a pang to lose that fine sight, but I lived down the desire and gained in my self-respect through the triumph. I had a finer and a grander sight, however, where I was. This was the mighty dome of the Jungfrau, softly outlined against the sky and faintly silvered by the starlight. There was something subduing in the influence of that silent and solemn and awful presence. One seemed to meet the immutable, the indestructible, the eternal, face to face, and to feel the trivial and fleeting nature of his own existence the more sharply by the contrast. One had the sense of being under the brooding contemplation of a spirit, not an inert mass of rocks and ice, a spirit which had looked down through the slow drift of the ages upon 1,000,000 vanished races of men, and judged them, and would judge 1,000,000 more, and still be there, watching, unchanged and unchangeable, after all life should be gone, and the earth have become a vacant desolation. While I was feeling these things, I was groping, without knowing it, toward an understanding of what the spell is which people find in the Alps, and in no other mountains, that strange, deep, nameless influence which, once felt, cannot be forgotten. Once felt leaves always behind it a restless longing to feel it again, a longing which is like homesickness, a grieving, haunting yearning which will plead, implore, and persecute till it has its will. I met dozens of people, imaginative and unimaginative, cultivated and uncultivated, who had come from far countries and roamed through the Swiss Alps year after year. They could not explain why. They had come first, they said, out of idle curiosity, because everybody talked about it. They had come since because they could not help it, and they should keep on coming while they lived for the same reason. They had tried to break their chains and stay away, but it was futile. Now they had no desire to break them. Others came nearer formulating what they felt. They said they could find perfect rest and peace nowhere else when they were troubled. All frets and worries and chafings sank to sleep in the presence of the benignant serenity of the Alps. The great spirit of the mountain breathed his own peace upon their hurt minds and sore hearts, and healed them. They could not think base thoughts or do mean and sordid things here before the visible throne of God. Down the road a piece was a Kursaal, whatever that may be, and we joined the human tide to see what sort of enjoyment it might afford. It was the usual open-air concert in an ornamental garden with wines, beer, milk, whey, grapes, etc., the whey and the grapes being necessities of life to certain invalids whom physicians cannot repair, and who only continue to exist by the grace of whey or grapes. One of these departed spirits told me, in a sad and lifeless way, that there was no way for him to live but by whey. Never drank anything now but whey, and dearly, dearly loved whey. He didn't know whey, he did, but he did. After making this pun, he died. That is the way it served him. Some other remains, preserved from decomposition by the grape system, told me that the grapes were of a peculiar breed, highly medicinal in their nature, and that they were counted out and administered by the grape doctors as methodically as if they were pills. The new patient, if very feeble, began with 1 grape before breakfast, took 3 during breakfast, a couple between meals, 5 at luncheon, 3 in the afternoon, 7 at dinner, 4 for supper, and part of a grape just before going to bed by way of a general regulator. The quantity was gradually and regularly increased according to the needs and capacities of the patient, until by and by you would find him disposing of his 1 grape per second all the day long, and his regular barrel per day. He said that men cured in this way, and enabled to discard the grape system, never afterwards got over the habit of talking as if they were dictating to a slow amanuensis, because they always made a pause between each 2 words while they sucked the substance out of an imaginary grape. He said these were tedious people to talk with. He said that men who had been cured by the other process were easily distinguished from the rest of mankind, because they always tilted their heads back between every 2 words, and swallowed a swig of imaginary whey. He said it was an impressive thing to observe 2 men who had been cured by the 2 processes engaged in conversation, said their pauses and accompanying movements were so continuous and regular that a stranger would think himself in the presence of a couple of automatic machines. One finds out a great many wonderful things by traveling, if he stumbles upon the right person. I did not remain long at the Kursaal. The music was good enough, but it seemed rather tame after the cyclone of that Arkansas expert. Besides, my adventurous spirit had conceived a formidable enterprise, nothing less than a trip from Interlaken by the Gemi and Visp clear to Zermatt, on foot. So it was necessary to plan the details and get ready for an early start. The courier, this was not the one I have just been speaking of, thought that the portier of the hotel would be able to tell us how to find our way. And so it turned out. He showed us the whole thing on a relief map, and we could see our route with all its elevations and depressions, its villages and its rivers, as clearly as if we were sailing over it in a balloon. A relief map is a great thing. The portier also wrote down each day's journey and the nightly hotel on a piece of paper, and made our course so plain that we should never be able to get lost without high-priced outside help. I put the courier in charge of a gentleman who was going to Lausanne, and then we went to bed after laying out the walking costumes and putting them into condition for instant occupation in the morning. However, when we came down to breakfast at 8 a.m., it looked so much like rain that I hired a 2-horse top buggy for the first third of the journey. For 2 or 3 hours we jogged along the level road which skirts the beautiful lake of Thun, with a dim and dreamlike picture of watery expanses and spectral alpine forms always before us, veiled in a mellowing mist. Then a steady downpour set in and hid everything but the nearest objects. We kept the rain out of our faces with umbrellas, and away from our bodies with the leather apron of the buggy. But the driver sat unsheltered and placidly soaked the weather in and seemed to like it. We had the road all to ourselves, and I never had a pleasanter excursion. The weather began to clear while we were driving up a valley called the Kiental, and presently a vast black cloud bank in front of us dissolved away and uncurtained the grand proportions and the soaring loftinesses of the Bloomis Alp. It was a sort of breathtaking surprise, for we had not supposed there was anything behind that low-hung blanket of sable cloud but level valley. What we had been mistaking for fleeting glimpses of sky away aloft there were really patches of the Bloomis's snowy crest, caught through shredded rents in the drifting pall of vapor. We dined in the inn at Frutigen, and our driver ought to have dined there too, but he would not have had time to dine and get drunk both, so he gave his mind to making a masterpiece of the latter, and succeeded. A German gentleman and his 2 young lady daughters had been taking their nooning at the inn, and when they left just ahead of us, it was plain that their driver was as drunk as ours, and as happy and good-natured, too, which was saying a good deal. These rascals overflowed with attentions and information for their guests, and with brotherly love for each other. They tied their reins and took off their coats and hats so that they might be able to give unencumbered attention to conversation and to the gestures necessary for its illustration. The road was smooth. It led up and over and down a continual succession of hills, but it was narrow. The horses were used to it and could not well get out of it anyhow, so why shouldn't the drivers entertain themselves and us? The noses of our horses projected sociably into the rear of the forward carriage, and as we toiled up the long hills, our driver stood up and talked to his friend, and his friend stood up and talked back to him, with his rear to the scenery. When the top was reached, and we went flying down the other side, there was no change in the program. I carry in my memory yet the picture of that forward driver, on his knees on his high seat, resting his elbows on its back, and beaming down on his passengers with happy eye and flying hair and jolly red face, and offering his card to the old German gentleman, while he praised his hack and horses, and both teams were whizzing down a long hill with nobody in a position to tell whether we were bound to destruction or an undeserved safety. Toward sunset we entered a beautiful green valley dotted with chalets, a cozy little domain hidden away from the busy world in a cloistered nook, among giant precipices topped with snowy peaks that seemed to float like islands above the curling surf of the sea of vapor that severed them from the lower world. Down from vague and vaporous heights, little ruffled zigzag milky currents came crawling, and found their way to the verge of one of those tremendous overhanging walls, whence they plunged, a shaft of silver, shivered to atoms in mid-descent, and turned to an airy puff of luminous dust. Here and there, in grooved depressions among the snowy desolations of the upper altitudes, one glimpsed the extremity of a glacier with its sea-green and honeycombed battlements of ice. Up the valley, under a dizzying precipice, nestled the village of Kandinsky, our halting place for the night. We were soon there, and housed in the hotel. But the waning day had such an inviting influence that we did not remain housed many moments, but struck out and followed a roaring torrent of ice water up to its far source in a sort of little grass-carpeted parlor, walled in all around by vast precipices and overlooked by clustering summits of ice. This was the snuggest little croquet ground imaginable. It was perfectly level and not more than a mile long by half a mile wide. The walls around it were so gigantic and everything about it was on so mighty a scale that it was belittled by contrast to what I have likened it to, a cozy and carpeted parlor. It was so high above the Kandinsky Valley that there was nothing between it and the snow peaks. I had never been in such intimate relations with the high altitudes before. The snow peaks had always been remote and unapproachable grandeurs hitherto, but now we were hob a nob, if one may use such a seemingly irreverent expression about creations so august as these. We could see the streams which fed the torrent we had followed, issuing from under the greenish ramparts of glaciers, but 2 or 3 of these, instead of flowing over the precipices, sank down into the rock and sprang in big jets out of holes in the mid-face of the walls. The green nook which I have been describing is called the Gastental. The glacier streams gather and flow through it in a broad and rushing brook to a narrow cleft between lofty precipices. Here the rushing brook becomes a mad torrent and goes booming and thundering down towards Kandinsky, lashing and thrashing its way over and among monster boulders, and hurling chance roots and logs about like straws. There was no lack of cascades along this route. The path by the side of the torrent was so narrow that one had to look sharp when he heard a cowbell, and hunt for a place that was wide enough to accommodate a cow and a Christian side by side, and such places were not always to be had at an instant's notice. The cows wear church bells, and that is a good idea in the cows, for where that torrent is, you couldn't hear an ordinary cowbell any further than you could hear the ticking of a watch. I needed exercise, so I employed my agent in setting stranded logs and dead trees adrift, and I sat on a boulder and watched them go whirling and leaping head over heels down the boiling torrent. It was a wonderfully exhilarating spectacle. When I had had exercise enough, I made the agent take some by running a race with one of those logs. I made a trifle by betting on the log. After dinner, we had a walk up and down the quiet Kandinsky Valley in the soft gloaming, with the spectacle of the dying lights of day playing about the crests and pinnacles of the still and solemn upper realms for contrast, and text for talk. There were no sounds but the dull complaining of the torrent and the occasional tinkling of a distant bell. The spirit of the place was a sense of deep, pervading peace. One might dream his life tranquilly away there and not miss it or mind it when it was gone. The summer departed with the sun, and winter came with the stars. It grew to be a bitter night in that little hotel, backed up against a precipice that had no visible top to it, but we kept warm and woke in time in the morning to find that everybody else had left for the Gemi 3 hours before. So our little plan of helping that German family, principally the old man, over the pass, was a blocked generosity. Chapter 34. We hired the only guide left to lead us on our way. He was over 70, but he could have given me 9/10 of his strength and still had all his age entitled him to. He shouldered our satchels, overcoats, and alpenstocks, and we set out up the path. It was hot work. The old man soon begged us to hand over our coats and waistcoats to him to carry too, and we did it. One could not refuse so little a thing to a poor old man like that. He should have had them if he had been 150. When we began that ascent, we could see a microscopic chalet perched away up against heaven on what seemed to be the highest mountain near us. It was on our right, across the narrow head of the valley. But when we got up abreast it, on its own level, mountains were towering high above on every hand, and we saw that its altitude was just about that of the little Gastental, which we had visited the evening before. Still, it seemed a long way up in the air, in the waste and lonely wilderness of rocks. It had an unfenced grass plot in front of it, which seemed about as big as a billiard table, and this grass plot slanted so sharply downwards and was so brief and ended so exceedingly soon at the verge of the absolute precipice that it was a shuddery thing to think of a person's venturing to trust his foot on an incline so situated at all. Suppose a man stepped on an orange peel in that yard. There would be nothing for him to seize. Nothing could keep him from rolling. 5 revolutions would bring him to the edge, and over he would go. What a frightful distance he would fall, for there are very few birds that fly as high as his starting point. He would strike and bounce 2 or 3 times on his way down, but this would be no advantage to him. I would as soon take an airing on the slant of a rainbow as in such a front yard. I would rather, in fact, for the distance down would be about the same, and it is pleasanter to slide than to bounce. I could not see how the peasants got up to that chalet. The region seemed too steep for anything but a balloon. As we strolled on, climbing up higher and higher, we were continually bringing neighboring peaks into view, and lofty prominences which had been hidden behind lower peaks before. So by and by, while standing before a group of these giants, we looked around for the chalet again. There it was, apparently on an inconspicuous ridge in the valley. It was as far below us now as it had been above us when we were beginning the ascent. After a while, the path led us along a railed precipice, and we looked over. Far beneath us was the snug parlor again, the little Gastental, with its water jets spouting from the face of its rock walls. We could have dropped a stone into it. We had been finding the top of the world all along, and always finding a still higher top stealing into view in a disappointing way just ahead. When we looked down into the Gastental, we felt pretty sure that we had reached the genuine top at last. But it was not so. There were much higher altitudes to be scaled yet. We were still in the pleasant shade of forest trees. We were still in a region which was cushioned with beautiful mosses, and aglow with the many-tinted luster of innumerable wildflowers. We found, indeed, more interest in the wildflowers than in anything else. We gathered a specimen or two of every kind which we were unacquainted with, so we had sumptuous bouquets. But one of the chief interests lay in chasing the seasons of the year up the mountain and determining them by the presence of flowers or berries which we were acquainted with. For instance, it was the end of August at the level of the sea. In the Kandinsky Valley, at the base of the pass, we found flowers which would not be due at the sea level for 2 or 3 weeks. Higher up we entered October, and gathered fringed gentians. I made no notes, and have forgotten the details, but the construction of the floral calendar was very entertaining while it lasted. In the high regions we found rich store of the splendid red flower called the Alpine rose, but we did not find any example of the ugly Swiss favorite called Edelweiss. Its name seems to indicate that it is a noble flower and that it is white. It may be noble enough, but it is not attractive, and it is not white. The fuzzy blossom is the color of bad cigar ashes. and appears to be made of a cheap quality of gray plush. It has a noble and distant way of confining itself to the high altitudes, but that is probably on account of its looks. It apparently has no monopoly of those upper altitudes, however, for they are sometimes intruded upon by some of the loveliest of the valley families of wild flowers. Everybody in the Alps wears a sprig of edelweiss in his hat. It is the native's pet, and also the tourist's. All the morning, as we loafed along, having a good time, other pedestrians went staving by us with vigorous strides, and with the intent and determined look of men who were walking for a wager. These wore loose knee breeches, long yarn stockings, and hobnailed, high-laced walking shoes. They were gentlemen who would go home to England or Germany and tell how many miles they had beaten the guidebook every day. But I doubted if they ever had much real fun outside of the mere magnificent exhilaration of the tramp through the green valleys and the breezy heights, for they were almost always alone, and even the finest scenery loses incalculably when there is no one to enjoy it with. All the morning, an endless double procession of mule-mounted tourists filed past us along the narrow path, the one procession going, the other coming. We had taken a good deal of trouble to teach ourselves the kindly German custom of saluting all strangers with doffed hat, and we resolutely clung to it that morning, although it kept us bareheaded most of the time, and was not always responded to. Still, we found an interest in the thing because we naturally liked to know who were English and Americans among the passers-by. All continental natives responded, of course. So did some of the English and Americans. But as a general thing, these two races gave no sign. Whenever a man or woman showed us cold neglect, we spoke up confidently in our own tongue and asked for such information as we happened to need, and we always got a reply in the same language. The English and American fold are not less kindly than other races. They are only more reserved, and that comes of habit and education. In one dreary, rocky waste, away above the line of vegetation, we met a procession of 25 mounted young men, all from America. We got answering bows enough from these, of course, for they were of an age to learn to do in Rome as Rome does, without much effort. At one extremity of this patch of desolation, overhung by bare and forbidding crags which husbanded drifts of everlasting snow in their shaded cavities, was a small stretch of thin and discouraged grass, and a man and a family of pigs were actually here in some shanties. Consequently, this place could be really reckoned as property. It had a money value, and was doubtless taxed. I think it must have marked the limit of real estate in this world. It would be hard to set a money value upon any piece of earth that lies between that spot and the empty realm of space. That man may claim the distinction of owning the end of the world, for if there is any definite end to the world, he has certainly found it. From here forward, we moved through a storm-swept and smileless desolation. All about us rose gigantic masses, crags and ramparts of bare and dreary rock, with not a vestige or semblance of plant or tree or flower anywhere, or glimpse of any creature that had life. The frost and the tempests of unnumbered ages had battered and hacked at these cliffs with a deathless energy, destroying them piecemeal. So all the region about their bases was a tumbled chaos of great fragments which had been split off and hurled to the ground. Soiled and aged banks of snow lay close about our path. The ghastly desolation of the place was as tremendously complete as if Doré had furnished the working plans for it. But every now and then, through the stern gateways around us, we caught a view of some neighboring majestic dome, sheathed with glittering ice, and displaying its white purity at an elevation compared to which ours was groveling and plebeian. And this spectacle always chained one's interest and admiration at once, and made him forget there was anything ugly in the world. I have just said that there was nothing but death and desolation in these hideous places, but I forgot. In the most forlorn and arid and dismal one of all, where the racked and splintered debris was thickest, where the ancient patches of snow lay against the very path, where the winds blew bitterest, and the general aspect was mournfullest and dreariest, and furthest from any suggestion of cheer or hope, I found a solitary wee forget-me-not flourishing away, not a droop about it anywhere, but holding its bright blue star up with the prettiest and gallantest air in the world, the only happy spirit, the only smiling thing in all that grisly desert. She seemed to say, "Cheer up. As long as we are here, let us make the best of it." I judged she had earned a right to a more hospitable place, so I plucked her up and sent her to America to a friend who would respect her for the fight she had made, all by her small self, to make a whole vast, despondent alpine desolation stop breaking its heart over the unalterable, and hold up its head and look at the bright side of things for once. We stopped for a nooning at a strongly built little inn called the Schwarenbach. It sits in a lonely spot among the peaks, where it is swept by the trailing fringes of the cloud-rack, and is rained on, snowed on, and pelted and persecuted by the storms nearly every day of its life. It was the only habitation in the whole Gemmi Pass. Close at hand now was a chance for a blood-curdling alpine adventure. Close at hand was the snowy mass of the great Altels, cooling its topknot in the sky, and daring us to an ascent. I was fired with the idea, and immediately made up my mind to procure the necessary guides, ropes, etc., and undertake it. I instructed Harris to go to the landlord of the inn and set him about our preparations. Meantime, I went diligently to work to read up and find out what this much-talked-of mountain climbing was like, and how one should go about it, for in these matters I was ignorant. I opened Mr. Hinchcliffe's Summer Months Among the Alps, published 1857, and selected his account of his ascent of Monte Rosa. It began, "It is very difficult to free the mind from excitement on the evening before a grand expedition." I saw that I was too calm, so I walked the room a while and worked myself into a high excitement. But the book's next remark, that the adventurer must get up at 2 in the morning, came as near as anything to flattening it all out again. However, I reinforced it and read on, about how Mr. Hinchcliffe dressed by candlelight and was soon down among the guides, who were bustling about in the passage, packing provisions and making every preparation for the start, and how he glanced out into the cold, clear night and saw that the whole sky was blazing with stars, larger and brighter than they appear through the dense atmosphere breathed by inhabitants of the lower parts of the earth. They seemed actually suspended from the dark vault of heaven, and their gentle light shed a fairy-like gleam over the snow-fields around the foot of the Matterhorn, which raised its stupendous pinnacle on high, penetrating to the heart of the Great Bear, and crowning itself with a diadem of his magnificent stars. Not a sound disturbed the deep tranquillity of the night, except the distant roar of streams which rush from the high plateau of the St. Theodule Glacier, and fall headlong over precipitous rocks till they lose themselves in the mazes of the Gorner Glacier. He took his hot toast and coffee, and then about 3:30 his caravan of 10 men filed away from the Riffel Hotel and began the steep climb. At 5:30 he happened to turn around and beheld the glorious spectacle of the Matterhorn just touched by the rosy-fingered morning, and looking like a huge pyramid of fire rising out of the barren ocean of ice and rock around it. Then the Brighthorn and the Dent Blanche caught the radiant glow, but the intervening mass of Monte Rosa made it necessary for us to climb many hours before we could hope to see the sun himself. Yet the whole air soon grew warmer after the splendid birth of day. He gazed at the lofty crown of Monte Rosa, and the wastes of snow that guarded its steep approaches, and the chief guide delivered the opinion that no man could conquer their awful heights and put his foot upon that summit. But the adventurers moved steadily on, nevertheless. They toiled up and still up. They passed the Grand Plateau, then toiled up a steep shoulder of the mountain, clinging like flies to its rugged face, and now they were confronted by a tremendous wall from which great blocks of ice and snow were evidently in the habit of falling. They turned aside to skirt this wall and gradually ascended until their way was barred by a maze of gigantic snow crevasses. So they turned aside again and began a long climb of sufficient steepness to make a zigzag course necessary. Fatigue compelled them to halt frequently for a moment or two. At one of these halts, somebody called out, "Look at Mont Blanc!" and we were at once made aware of the very great height we had attained by actually seeing the monarch of the Alps and his attendant satellites right over the top of the Brighthorn, itself at least 14,000 feet high. These people moved in single file and were all tied to a strong rope at regular distances apart, so that if one of them slipped on those giddy heights, the others could brace themselves on their alpenstocks and save him from darting into the valley thousands of feet below. By and by they came to an ice-coated ridge, which was tilted up at a sharp angle and had a precipice on one side of it. They had to climb this, so the guide in the lead cut steps in the ice with his hatchet, and as fast as he took his toes out of one of these slight holes, the toes of the man behind him occupied it. Slowly and steadily we kept on our way over this dangerous part of the ascent, and I dare say it was fortunate for some of us that attention was distracted from the head by the paramount necessity of looking after the feet. For while on the left the incline of ice was so steep that it would be impossible for any man to save himself in case of a slip, unless the others could hold him up, on the right we might drop a pebble from the hand over precipices of unknown extent down upon the tremendous glacier below. Great caution, therefore, was absolutely necessary. And in this exposed situation we were attacked by all the fury of that grand enemy of aspirants to Monte Rosa, a severe and bitterly cold wind from the north. The fine powdery snow was driven past us in clouds, penetrating the interstices of our clothes, and the pieces of ice which flew from the blows of Peter's axe were whisked into the air and then dashed over the precipice. We had quite enough to do to prevent ourselves from being served in the same ruthless fashion, and now and then, in the more violent gusts of wind, were glad to stick our alpenstocks into the ice and hold on hard. Having surmounted this perilous steep, they sat down and took a brief rest with their backs against a sheltering rock and their heels dangling over a bottomless abyss. Then they climbed to the base of another ridge, a more difficult and dangerous one still. The whole of the ridge was exceedingly narrow, and the fall on each side desperately steep, but the ice in some of these intervals between the masses of rock assumed the form of a mere sharp edge, almost like a knife. These places, though not more than 3 or 4 short paces in length, looked uncommonly awkward. But like the sword leading true believers to the gates of paradise, they must needs be passed before we could attain to the summit of our ambition. These were in one or two places so narrow that in stepping over them with toes well turned out for greater security, one end of the foot projected over the awful precipice on the right, while the other was on the beginning of the icy slope on the left, which was scarcely less steep than the rocks. On these occasions, Peter would take my hand, and each of us stretching as far as we could, he was thus enabled to get a firm footing 2 paces or rather more from me, whence a spring would probably bring him to the rock on the other side. Then, turning round, he called to me to come, and taking a couple of steps carefully, I was met at the third by his outstretched hand ready to clasp mine, and in a moment stood by his side. The others followed in much the same fashion. Once my right foot slipped on the side towards the precipice, but I threw out my left arm in a movement so that it caught the icy edge under my armpit as I fell, and supported me considerably. At the same instant I cast my eyes down the side on which I had slipped, and contrived to plant my right foot on a piece of rock as large as a cricket ball, which chanced to protrude through the ice on the very edge of the precipice. Being thus anchored fore and aft, as it were, I believe I could easily have recovered myself, even if I had been alone, though it must be confessed the situation would have been an awful one. As it was, however, a jerk from Peter settled the matter very soon, and I was on my legs all right in an instant. The rope is an immense help in places of this kind. Now they arrived at the base of a great knob or dome veneered with ice and powdered with snow, the utmost summit, the last bit of solidity between them and the hollow vault of heaven. They set to work with their hatchets, and were soon creeping insect-like up its surface, with their heels projecting over the thinnest kind of nothingness, thickened up a little with a few wandering shreds and films of cloud moving in lazy procession far below. Presently, one man's toe-hold broke, and he fell. There he dangled in mid-air at the end of the rope like a spider, till his friends above hauled him into place again. A little bit later, the party stood upon the wee pedestal of the very summit in a driving wind, and looked out upon the vast green expanses of Italy and a shoreless ocean of billowy Alps. When I had read thus far, Harris burst into the room in a noble excitement and said the ropes and the guides were secured, and asked if I was ready. I said I believed I wouldn't ascend the Altels this time. I said Alp climbing was a different thing from what I had supposed it was, and so I judged we had better study its points a little more before we went definitely into it. But I told him to retain the guides and order them to follow us to Zermatt, because I meant to use them there. I said I could feel the spirit of adventure beginning to stir in me, and was sure that the fell fascination of Alp climbing would soon be upon me. I said he could make up his mind to it, that we would do a deed before we were a week older, which would make the hair of the timid curl with fright. This made Harris happy, and filled him with ambitious anticipations. He went at once to tell the guides to follow us to Zermatt, and bring all their paraphernalia with them. Chapter 35. A great and priceless thing is a new interest. How it takes possession of a man, how it clings to him, how it rides him. I strode onward from the Schwarenbach hostelry a changed man, a reorganized personality. I walked in a new world. I saw with new eyes. I had been looking aloft at the giant snow peaks only as things to be worshipped for their grandeur and magnitude, and their unspeakable grace of form. I looked up at them now as also things to be conquered and climbed. My sense of their grandeur and their noble beauty was neither lost nor impaired. I had gained a new interest in the mountains without losing the old ones. I followed the steep lines up inch by inch with my eye, and noted the possibility or impossibility of following them with my feet. When I saw a shining helmet of ice projecting above the clouds, I tried to imagine I saw files of black specks toiling up it, roped together with a gossamer thread. We skirted the lonely little lake called the Daubensee, and presently passed close by a glacier on the right, a thing like a great river, frozen solid in its flow and broken square off like a wall at its mouth. I had never been so near a glacier before. Here we came upon a new board shanty and found some men engaged in building a stone house. So the Schwarenbach was soon to have a rival. We bought a bottle or so of beer here. At any rate, they called it beer, but I knew by the price that it was dissolved jewelry, and I perceived by the taste that dissolved jewelry is not good stuff to drink. We were surrounded by a hideous desolation. We stepped forward to a sort of jumping-off place and were confronted by a startling contrast. We seemed to look down into fairyland. We stepped forward to a sort of jumping-off place and were confronted by a startling contrast. We seemed to look down into fairyland. 2,000 or 3,000 feet below us was a bright green level with a pretty town in its midst and a silvery stream winding among the meadows. The charming spot was walled in on all sides by gigantic precipices clothed with pines, and over the pines, out of the softened distances, rose the snowy domes and peaks of the Monte Rosa region. How exquisitely green and beautiful that little valley down there was. The distance was not great enough to obliterate details. It only made them little and mellow and dainty, like landscapes in towns seen through the wrong end of a spyglass. Right under us, a narrow ledge rose up out of the valley with a green, slanting, bench-shaped top, and grouped about upon this green baize bench were a lot of black and white sheep, which looked merely like oversized worms. The bench seemed lifted well up into our neighborhood, but that was a deception. It was a long way down to it. We began our descent now by the most remarkable road I have ever seen. It wound in corkscrew curves down the face of the colossal precipice, a narrow way, with always the solid rock wall at one elbow, and perpendicular nothingness at the other. We met an everlasting procession of guides, porters, mules, litters, and tourists climbing up this steep and muddy path, and there was no room to spare when you had to pass a tolerably fat mule. I always took the inside when I heard or saw the mule coming, and flattened myself against the wall. I preferred the inside, of course, but I should have had to take it anyhow, because the mule prefers the outside. A mule's preference on a precipice is a thing to be respected. Well, his choice is always the outside. His life is mostly devoted to carrying bulky panniers and packages which rest against his body. Therefore, he is habituated to taking the outside edge of mountain paths to keep his bundles from rubbing against rocks or banks on the other. When he goes into the passenger business, he absurdly clings to his old habit and keeps one leg of his passenger always dangling over the great deeps of the lower world, while that passenger's heart is in the highlands, so to speak. More than once I saw a mule's hind foot cave over the outer edge and send earth and rubbish into the bottomless abyss, and I noticed that upon these occasions the rider, whether male or female, looked tolerably unwell. There was one place where an 18-inch breadth of light masonry had been added to the verge of the path, and as there was a very sharp turn here, a panel of fencing had been set up there at some ancient time as a protection. This panel was old and gray and feeble, and the light masonry had been loosened by recent rain. A young American girl came along on a mule, and in making the turn, the mule's hind foot caved all the loose masonry and one of the fence posts overboard. The mule gave a violent lurch inboard to save himself, and succeeded in the effort, but that girl turned as white as the snows of Mont Blanc for a moment. The path here was simply a groove cut into the face of the precipice. There was a 4-foot breadth of solid rock under the traveler, and a 4-foot breadth of solid rock just above his head, like the roof of a narrow porch. He could look out from this gallery and see a sheer, summitless, and bottomless wall of rock before him, across a gorge or crack a biscuit's toss in width, but he could not see the bottom of his own precipice unless he lay down and projected his nose over the edge. I did not do this because I did not wish to soil my clothes. Every few hundred yards, at particularly bad places, one came across a panel or so of plank fencing. But they were always old and weak, and they generally leaned out over the chasm and did not make any rash promises to hold up people who might need support. There was one of these panels which had only its upper board left. A pedestrianizing English youth came tearing down the path, was seized with an impulse to look over the precipice, and without an instant's thought he threw his weight upon that crazy board. It bent outward a foot. I never made a gasp before that came so near suffocating me. The English youth's face simply showed a lively surprise, but nothing more. He went swinging along valleywards again, as if he did not know he had just swindled a coroner by the closest kind of a shave. The alpine litter is sometimes like a cushioned box made fast between the middles of 2 long poles, and sometimes it is a chair with a back to it and a support for the feet. It is carried by relays of strong porters. The motion is easier than that of any other conveyance. We met a few men and a great many ladies in litters. It seemed to me that most of the ladies looked pale and nauseated. Their general aspect gave me the idea that they were patiently enduring a horrible suffering. As a rule, they looked at their laps and left the scenery to take care of itself. But the most frightened creature I saw was a led horse that overtook us. Poor fellow! He had been born and reared in the grassy levels of the Kandinsky Valley, and had never seen anything like this hideous place before. Every few steps he would stop short, glance wildly out from the dizzy height, and then spread his red nostrils wide and pant as violently as if he had been running a race. And all the while he quaked from head to heel as with a palsy. He was a handsome fellow, and he made a fine, statuesque picture of terror, but it was pitiful to see him suffer so. This dreadful path has had its tragedy. Baedeker, with his customary over-terseness, begins and ends the tale thus. The descent on horseback should be avoided. In 1861, a Comtesse d'Elicourt fell from her saddle over the precipice and was killed on the spot. We looked over the precipice there and saw the monument which commemorates the event. It stands in the bottom of the gorge, in a place which has been hollowed out of the rock to protect it from the torrent and the storms. Our old guide never spoke but when spoken to, and then limited himself to a syllable or two, but when we asked him about this tragedy, he showed a strong interest in the matter. He said the Countess was very pretty and very young, hardly out of her girlhood, in fact. She was newly married and was on her bridal tour. The young husband was riding a little in advance. One guide was leading the husband's horse, another was leading the bride's. The old man continued. The guide that was leading the husband's horse happened to glance back, and there was that poor young thing sitting up, staring out over the precipice. And her face began to bend downward a little, and she put up her 2 hands slowly and met it so, and put them flat against her eyes so, and then she sank out of the saddle with a sharp shriek, and one caught only the flash of a dress, and it was all over. Then, after a pause, "Ah, yes, that guide saw these things. Yes, he saw them all. He saw them all, just as I have told you." After another pause, "Ah, yes, he saw them all. My God, that was me. I was that guide." This had been the one event of the old man's life, so one may be sure he had forgotten no detail connected with it. We listened to all he had to say about what was done, and what happened, and what was said after the sorrowful occurrence, and a painful story it was. When we had wound down toward the valley until we were about on the last spiral of the corkscrew, Harris's hat blew over the last remaining bit of precipice, a small cliff 100 or 150 feet high, and sailed down towards a steep slant composed of rough chips and fragments which the weather had flaked away from the precipices. We went leisurely down there, expecting to find it without any trouble. But we had made a mistake as to that. We hunted during a couple of hours, not because the old straw hat was valuable, but out of curiosity to find out how such a thing could manage to conceal itself in open ground, where there was nothing for it to hide behind. When one is reading in bed and lays his paper knife down, he cannot find it again if it is smaller than a saber. That hat was as stubborn as any paper knife could have been, and we finally had to give it up. But we found a fragment that had once belonged to an opera glass, and by digging around and turning over the rocks, we gradually collected all the lenses and the cylinders and the various odds and ends that go to make up a complete opera glass. We afterwards had the thing reconstructed, and the owner can have his adventurous long-lost property by submitting proofs and paying costs of rehabilitation. We had hopes of finding the owner there, distributed around amongst the rocks, for it would have made an elegant paragraph, but we were disappointed. Still, we were far from being disheartened, for there was a considerable area which we had not thoroughly searched. We were satisfied he was there somewhere, so we resolved to wait over a day at Leuk and come back and get him. Then we sat down to polish off the perspiration and arrange about what we could do with him when we got him. Harris was for contributing him to the British Museum, but I was for mailing him to his widow. That is the difference between Harris and me. Harris is all for display. I am all for the simple right, even though I lose money by it. Harris argued in favor of his proposition and against mine. I argued in favor of mine and against his. The discussion warmed into a dispute. The dispute warmed into a quarrel. I finally said very decidedly, "My mind is made up. He goes to the widow." Harris answered sharply, "And my mind is made up. He goes to the museum." I said calmly, "The museum may whistle when it gets him." Harris retorted, "The widow may save herself the trouble of whistling, for I will see that she never gets him." After some angry bandying of epithets, I said, "It seems to me that you are taking on a good many airs about these remains. I don't quite see what you've got to say about them." I've got all to say about them. They'd never have been thought of if I hadn't found their opera glass. The corpse belongs to me, and I'll do as I please with it. I was the leader of the expedition, and all discoveries achieved by it naturally belonged to me. I was entitled to these remains, and could have enforced my right, but rather than have bad blood about the matter, I said we would toss up for them. I threw heads and won. But it was a barren victory, for although we spent all the next day searching, we never found a bone. I cannot imagine what could ever have become of that fellow. The town in the valley is called Leuk, or Leukerbad. We pointed our course toward it, down a verdant slope which was adorned with fringed gentians and other flowers, and presently entered the narrow alleys of the outskirts and waded toward the middle of the town through liquid fertilizer. They ought to either pave that village or organize a ferry. Harris's body was simply a chamois pasture. His person was populous with the little hungry pests. His skin, when he stripped, was splotched like a scarlet fever patient's. So when we were about to enter one of the Leukerbad inns, and he noticed its sign, Chamois Hotel, he refused to stop there. He said the chamois was plentiful enough without hunting up hotels where they made a specialty of it. I was indifferent, for the chamois is a creature that will neither bite me nor abide with me. But to calm Harris, we went to the Hôtel des Alpes. At the table d'hôte we had this for an incident. A very grave man, in fact his gravity amounted to solemnity and almost to austerity, sat opposite us, and he was tight, but doing his best to appear sober. He took up a corked bottle of wine, tilted it over his glass a while, then set it out of the way with a contented look and went on with his dinner. Presently he put his glass to his mouth and, of course, found it empty. He looked puzzled and glanced furtively and suspiciously out of the corner of his eye at a benignant and unconscious old lady who sat at his right, shook his head as much as to say, "No, she couldn't have done it." He tilted the corked bottle over his glass again, meantime searching around with his watery eye to see if anybody was watching him. He ate a few mouthfuls, raised his glass to his lips, and of course it was still empty. He bent an injured and accusing side gaze upon that unconscious old lady, which was a study to see. She went on eating and gave no sign. He took up his glass and his bottle with a wise, private nod of his head and set them gravely on the left-hand side of his plate, poured himself another imaginary drink, went to work with his knife and fork once more, presently lifted his glass with good confidence and found it empty, as usual. This was almost a petrifying surprise. He straightened himself up in his chair, and deliberately and sorrowfully inspected the busy old ladies at his elbows, first one and then the other. At last he softly pushed his plate away, set his glass directly in front of him, held onto it with his left hand, and proceeded to pour with his right. This time he observed that nothing came. He turned the bottle clear upside down. Still nothing issued from it. A plaintive look came into his face, and he said as if to himself, "They've got it all." Then he set the bottle down resignedly and took the rest of his dinner dry. It was at that table d'hôte, too, that I had under inspection the largest lady I have ever seen in private life. She was over 7 feet high and magnificently proportioned. What had first called my attention to her was my stepping on an outlaying flange of her foot, and hearing from up toward the ceiling a deep, "Pardon, monsieur, but you encroach." That was when we were coming through the hall, and the place was dim, and I could see her only vaguely. The thing which called my attention to her the second time was that at a table beyond ours were 2 very pretty girls, and this great lady came in and sat down between them and me and blotted out the view. She had a handsome face, and she was very finely formed, perfectly formed, I should say. But she made everybody around her look trivial and commonplace. Ladies near her looked like children, and the men about her looked mean. They looked like failures, and they looked as if they felt so, too. She sat with her back to us. I never saw such a back in my life. I would have so liked to see the moon rise over it. The whole congregation waited, under one pretext or another, till she finished her dinner and went out. They wanted to see her at her full attitude, and they found it worth tarrying for. She filled one's idea of what an empress ought to be when she rose up in her unapproachable grandeur and moved superbly out of that place. We were not at Leuk in time to see her at her heaviest weight. She had suffered from corpulence and had come there to get rid of her extra flesh in the baths. 5 weeks of soaking, 5 uninterrupted hours of it every day, had accomplished her purpose and reduced her to the right proportions. Those baths remove fat and also skin diseases. The patients remain in the great tanks hours at a time. A dozen gentlemen and ladies occupy a tank together and amuse themselves with rompings and various games. They have floating desks and tables, and they read or lunch or play chess in water that is breast deep. The tourist can step in and view this novel spectacle if he chooses. There's a poor box, and he will have to contribute. There are several of these big bathing houses, and you can always tell when you are near one of them by the romping noises and shouts of laughter that proceed from it. The water is running water, and changes all the time. Else a patient with a ringworm might take the bath with only a partial success, since while he was ridding himself of his ringworm, he might catch the itch. The next morning we wandered back up the green valley, leisurely, with the curving walls of those bare and stupendous precipices rising into the clouds before us. I had never seen a clean, bare precipice stretching up 5,000 feet above me before, and I never shall expect to see another one. They exist, perhaps, but not in places where one can easily get close to them. This pile of stone is peculiar. From its base to the soaring tops of its mighty towers, all its lines and all its details vaguely suggest human architecture. There are rudimentary bow windows, cornices, chimneys, demarcations of stories, etc. And one could sit and stare up there and study the features and exquisite graces of this grand structure bit by bit and day after day, and never weary his interest. The termination toward the town, observed in profile, is the perfection of shape. It comes down out of the clouds in a succession of rounded, colossal, terrace-like projections, a stairway for the gods. At its head spring several lofty, storm-scarred towers, one above another, with faint films of vapor curling always about them like spectral banners. If there were a king whose realms included the whole world, here would be the palace meet and proper for such a monarch. He would only need to hollow it out and put in the electric light. He could give audience to a nation at a time under its roof. Our search for those remains having failed, we inspected with a glass the dim and distant track of an old-time avalanche that once swept down from some pine-grown summits behind the town, and swept away the houses and buried the people. Then we struck down the road that leads toward the Rhone to see the famous ladders. These perilous things are built against the perpendicular face of a cliff 200 or 300 feet high. The peasants of both sexes were climbing up and down them with heavy loads on their backs. I ordered Harris to make the ascent, so I could put the thrill and horror of it in my book, and he accomplished the feat successfully, through a sub-agent, for 3 francs, which I paid. It makes me shudder yet when I think of what I felt when I was clinging there between heaven and earth in the person of that proxy. At times the world swam around me, and I could hardly keep from letting go, so dizzying was the appalling danger. Many a person would have given up and descended, but I stuck to my task, and would not yield until I had accomplished it. I felt a just pride in my exploit, but I would not have repeated it for the wealth of the world. I shall break my neck yet with some such foolhardy performance, for warnings never seem to have any lasting effect upon me. When the people of the hotel found that I had been climbing those crazy ladders, it made me an object of considerable distinction. Next morning, early, we drove to the Rhone Valley and took the train for Visp. There we shouldered our knapsacks and things and set out on foot, in a tremendous rain, up the winding gorge towards Zermatt. Hour after hour we slopped along by the roaring torrent and under noble lesser Alps, which were clothed in rich velvety green all the way up, and had little atomy Swiss homes perched upon grassy benches along their mist-dimmed heights. The rain continued to pour and torrent to boom, and we continued to enjoy both. At the one spot where this torrent tossed its white mane highest and thundered loudest and lashed the big boulders fiercest, the canton had done itself the honor to build the flimsiest wooden bridge that exists in the world. While we were walking over it, along with a party of horsemen, I noticed that even the larger raindrops made it shake. I called Harris's attention to it, and he noticed it too. It seemed to me that if I owned an elephant that was a keepsake, and I thought a good deal of him, I would think twice before I would ride him over that bridge. We climbed up to the village of St. Nicholas about 4:30 in the afternoon, waded ankle-deep through the fertilizer juice, and stopped at a new and nice hotel close by the little church. We stripped and went to bed and sent our clothes down to be baked. All the horde of soaked tourists did the same. That chaos of clothing got mixed in the kitchen, and there were consequences. I did not get back the same drawers I sent down when our things came up at 6:15. I got a pair on a new plan. They were merely a pair of white ruffle-cuffed absurdities, hitched together at the top with a narrow band, and they did not come quite down to my knees. They were pretty enough, but they made me feel like two people, and disconnected at that. The man must have been an idiot that got himself up like that to rough it in the Swiss mountains. The shirt they brought me was shorter than the drawers, and hadn't any sleeves to it. At least it hadn't anything more than what Mr. Darwin would call rudimentary sleeves. These had edging around them, but the bosom was ridiculously plain. The knit silk undershirt they brought me was on a new plan, and was really a sensible thing. It opened behind, and had pockets in it to put your shoulder blades in, but they did not seem to fit mine, and so I found it a sort of uncomfortable garment. They gave my bobtail coat to somebody else and sent me an ulster suitable for a giraffe. I had to tie my collar on, because there was no button behind on that foolish little shirt which I described a while ago. When I was dressed for dinner at 6:30, I was too loose in some places and too tight in others, and altogether I felt slovenly and ill-conditioned. However, the people at the table d'hôte were no better off than I was. They had everybody's clothes but their own on. A long stranger recognized his ulster as soon as he saw the tail of it following me in, but nobody claimed my shirts or my drawers, though I described them as well as I was able. I gave them to the chambermaid that night when I went to bed, and she probably found the owner, for my own things were on a chair outside my door in the morning. There was a lovable English clergyman who did not get to the table d'hôte at all. His breeches had turned up missing, and without any equivalent. He said he was not more particular than other people, but he had noticed that a clergyman at dinner without any breeches was almost sure to excite remark. Chapter 36. We did not sleep over at St. Nicholas. The church bell began to ring at 4:30 in the morning, and from the length of time it continued to ring, I judged that it takes the Swiss sinner a good while to get the invitation through his head. Most church bells in the world are of poor quality and have a harsh and rasping sound which upsets the temper and produces much sin. But the St. Nicholas bell is a good deal the worst one that has been contrived yet, and is peculiarly maddening in its operation. Still, it may have its right and its excuse to exist, for the community is poor, and not every citizen can afford a clock, perhaps. But there cannot be any excuse for our church bells at home, for there is no family in America without a clock, and consequently there is no fair pretext for the usual Sunday medley of dreadful sounds that issues from our steeples. There is much more profanity in America on Sunday than in all the other 6 days of the week put together, and it is of a more bitter and malignant character than the weekday profanity, too. It is produced by the cracked-pot clangor of the cheap church bells. We build our churches almost without regard to cost. We rear an edifice which is an adornment to the town, and we gild it, and fresco it, and mortgage it, and do everything we can think of to perfect it, and then spoil it all by putting a bell on it which afflicts everybody who hears it, giving some the headache, others St. Vitus' dance, and the rest the blind staggers. An American village at 10 o'clock on a summer Sunday is the quietest and peacefulest and holiest thing in nature. But it is a pretty different thing half an hour later. Mr. Poe's poem of the bells stands incomplete to this day, but it is well enough that it is so, for the public reciter or reader who goes around trying to imitate the sounds of the various sorts of bells with his voice would find himself up a stump when he got to the church bell, as Joseph Addison would say. The church is always trying to get other people to reform. It might not be a bad idea to reform itself a little by way of example. It is still clinging to one or two things which were useful once, but which are not useful now. Neither are they ornamental. One is the bell ringing to remind a clock-caked town that it is church time, and another is the reading from the pulpit of a tedious list of notices which everybody who is interested has already read in the newspaper. The clergyman even reads the hymn through, a relic of an ancient time when hymn books were scarce and costly. But everybody has a hymn book now, and so the public reading is no longer necessary. It is not merely unnecessary, it is generally painful, for the average clergyman could not fire into his congregation with a shotgun and hit a worse reader than himself, unless the weapon scattered shamefully. I am not meaning to be flippant and irreverent, I am only meaning to be truthful. The average clergyman in all countries and of all denominations is a very bad reader. One would think he would at least learn how to read the Lord's Prayer by and by, but it is not so. He races through it as if he thought the quicker he got it in, the sooner it would be answered. A person who does not appreciate the exceeding value of pauses and does not know how to measure their duration judiciously cannot render the grand simplicity and dignity of a composition like that effectively. We took a tolerably early breakfast and tramped off toward Zermatt through the reeking lanes of the village, glad to get away from that bell. By and by, we had a fine spectacle on our right. It was the warlike butt-end of a huge glacier which looked down on us from an alpine height which was well up in the blue sky. It was an astonishing amount of ice to be compacted together in one mass. We ciphered upon it and decided that it was not less than several hundred feet from the base of the wall of solid ice on the top of it. Harris believed it was really twice that. We judged that if St. Paul's, St. Peter's, the Great Pyramid, the Strasbourg Cathedral, and the Capitol at Washington were clustered against that wall, a man sitting on its upper edge could not hang his hat on the top of any one of them without reaching down 300 or 400 feet, a thing which, of course, no man could do. To me, that mighty glacier was very beautiful. I did not imagine that anybody could find fault with it, but I was mistaken. Harris had been snarling for several days. He was a rabid Protestant, and he was always saying, "In the Protestant cantons you never see such poverty and dirt and squalor as you do in this Catholic one. You never see the lanes and alleys flowing with foulness. You never see such wretched little sties of houses. You never see an inverted tin turnip on top of a church for a dome. And as for a church bell, why, you never hear a church bell at all." All this morning he had been finding fault straight along. First it was with the mud. He said, "It ain't muddy in a Protestant canton when it rains." Then it was with the dogs. "They don't have those lop-eared dogs in a Protestant canton." Then it was with the roads. "They don't leave the roads to make themselves in a Protestant canton. The people make them, and they make a road that is a road, too." Next it was the goats. "You never see a goat shedding tears in a Protestant canton. A goat there is one of the cheerfulest objects in nature." Next it was the chamois. "You never see a Protestant chamois act like one of these. They take a bite or two and go, but these fellows camp with you and stay." Then it was the guide boards. "In a Protestant canton, you couldn't get lost if you wanted to, but you never see a guide board in a Catholic canton." Next, "You never see any flower boxes in the windows here, never anything but now and then a cat, a torpid one, but you take a Protestant canton, windows perfectly lovely with flowers, and as for cats, there's just acres of them. These folks in this canton leave a road to make itself, and then fine you 3 francs if you trot over it, as if a horse could trot over such a sarcasm of a road." Next, about the goiter. "They talk about the goiter. I haven't seen a goiter in this whole canton that I couldn't put in a hat." He had growled at everything, but I judged it would puzzle him to find anything the matter with this majestic glacier. I intimated as much, but he was ready, and said with surly discontent, "You ought to see them in the Protestant cantons." This irritated me, but I concealed the feeling and asked, "What is the matter with this one?" "Matter? Why, it ain't in any kind of condition. They never take any care of a glacier here. The moraine has been spilling gravel around it and got it all dirty." "Why, man, they can't help that." "They? You're right. That is, they won't. They could if they wanted to. You never see a speck of dirt on a Protestant glacier. Look at the Rhone Glacier. It is 15 miles long and 700 feet thick. If this was a Protestant glacier, you wouldn't see it looking like this, I can tell you." "That is nonsense. What would they do with it?" "They would whitewash it. They always do." I did not believe a word of this, but rather than have trouble, I let it go, for it is a waste of breath to argue with a bigot. I even doubted if the Rhone Glacier was in a Protestant canton, but I did not know, so I could not make anything by contradicting a man who would probably put me down at once with manufactured evidence. About 9 miles from St. Nicholas, we crossed a bridge over the raging torrent of the Fisp, and came to a long strip of flimsy fencing, which was pretending to secure people from tumbling over a precipice wall 40 feet high and into the river. 3 children were approaching. One of them, a little girl about 8 years old, was running. When pretty close to us, she stumbled and fell, and her feet shot under the rail of the fence and for a moment projected over the stream. It gave us a sharp shock, for we thought she was gone, sure, for the ground slanted steeply, and to save herself seemed a sheer impossibility. But she managed to scramble up and ran by us, laughing. We went forward and examined the place, and saw the long tracks which her feet had made in the dirt when they darted over the verge. If she had finished her trip, she would have struck some big rocks on the edge of the water, and then the torrent would have snatched her downstream among the half-covered boulders, and she would have been pounded to pulp in 2 minutes. We had come exceedingly near witnessing her death. And now Harris's contrary nature and inborn selfishness were strikingly manifested. He has no spirit of self-denial. He began straight off and continued for an hour to express his gratitude that the child was not destroyed. I never saw such a man. That was the kind of person he was. Just so he was gratified, he never cared anything about anybody else. I had noticed that trait in him over and over again. Of course, it was mere heedlessness, mere want of reflection. Doubtless this may have been the case in most instances, but it was not the less hard to bear on that account. After all, its bottom, its groundwork, was selfishness. There is no avoiding that conclusion. In the instance under consideration, I did think the indecency of running on in that way might occur to him, but no, the child was saved, and he was glad. That was sufficient. He cared not a straw for my feelings or my loss of such a literary plum, snatched from my very mouth at the instant it was ready to drop into it. His selfishness was sufficient to place his own gratification in being spared suffering clear before all concern for me, his friend. Apparently he did not once reflect upon the valuable details which would have fallen like a windfall to me, fishing the child out, witnessing the surprise of the family and the stir the thing would have made among the peasants, then a Swiss funeral, then the roadside monument to be paid for by us and have our names mentioned in it, and we should have gone into Baedeker and been immortal. I was silent. I was too much hurt to complain. If he could act so, and be so heedless and so frivolous at such a time, and actually seem to glory in it, after all I had done for him, I would cut off my hand before I would let him see that I was wounded. We were approaching Zermatt. Consequently, we were approaching the renowned Matterhorn. A month before, this mountain had been only a name to us, but laterally we had been moving through a steadily thickening double row of pictures of it, done in oil, water, chromo, wood, steel, copper, crayon, and photography. And so it had at length become a shape to us, and a very distinct, decided, and familiar one, too. We were expecting to recognize that mountain whenever or wherever we should run across it. We were not deceived. The monarch was far away when we first saw him, but there was no such thing as mistaking him. He has the rare peculiarity of standing by himself. He is peculiarly steep, too, and is also most oddly shaped. He towers into the sky like a colossal wedge, with the upper third of its blade bent a little to the left. The broad base of this monster wedge is planted upon a grand glacier-paved alpine platform, whose elevation is 10,000 feet above sea level. As the wedge itself is some 5,000 feet high, it follows that its apex is about 15,000 feet above sea level, so the whole bulk of this stately piece of rock, this sky-cleaving monolith, is above the line of eternal snow. Yet while all its giant neighbors have the look of being built of solid snow from their waists up, the Matterhorn stands black and naked and forbidding the year round, or merely powdered or streaked with white in places, for its sides are so steep that the snow cannot stay there. Its strange form, its august isolation, and its majestic unkinship with its own kind make it, so to speak, the Napoleon of the mountain world. Grand, gloomy, and peculiar is a phrase which fits it as aptly as it fitted the great captain. Think of a monument a mile high, standing on a pedestal 2 miles high. Think of a monument a mile high, standing on a pedestal 2 miles high. This is what the Matterhorn is, a monument. Its office, henceforth, for all time, will be to keep watch and ward over the secret resting place of the young Lord Douglas, who in 1865 was precipitated from the summit over a precipice 4,000 feet high and never seen again. No man ever had such a monument as this before. The most imposing of the world's other monuments are but atoms compared to it, and they will perish, and their places will pass from memory, but this will remain. The accident which cost Lord Douglas his life also cost the lives of 3 other men. These 3 fell 4/5 of a mile, and their bodies were afterwards found lying side by side upon a glacier, whence they were borne to Zermatt and buried in the churchyard. The remains of Lord Douglas have never been found. The secret of his sepulchre, like that of Moses, must remain a mystery always. A walk from St. Nicholas to Zermatt is a wonderful experience. Nature is built on a stupendous plan in that region. One marches continually between walls that are piled into the skies, with their upper heights broken into a confusion of sublime shapes that gleam white and cold against the background of blue. And here and there one sees a big glacier displaying its grandeurs on the top of a precipice, or a graceful cascade leaping and flashing down the green declivities. There is nothing tame or cheap or trivial. It is all magnificent. That short valley is a picture gallery of a notable kind, for it contains no mediocrities. From end to end the Creator has hung it with his masterpieces. We made Zermatt at 3 in the afternoon, 9 hours out from St. Nicholas. Distance by guidebook, 12 miles. By pedometer, 72. We were in the heart and home of the mountain climbers now, as all visible things testified. The snow peaks did not hold themselves aloof in aristocratic reserve. They nestled close around in a friendly, sociable way. Guides, with the ropes and axes and other implements of their fearful calling slung about their persons, roosted in a long line upon a stone wall in front of the hotel and waited for customers. Sunburned climbers in mountaineering costume, and followed by their guides and porters, arrived from time to time from breakneck expeditions among the peaks and glaciers of the high Alps. Male and female tourists on mules filed by in a continuous procession, hotelward bound, from wild adventures which would grow in grandeur every time they were described at the English or American fireside, and at last outgrow the possible itself. We were not dreaming. This was not a make-believe home of the Alp climber created by our heated imaginations. No, for here was Mr. Girdlestone himself, the famous Englishman who hunts his way to the most formidable alpine summits without a guide. I was not equal to imagining a Girdlestone. It was all I could do to even realize him while looking straight at him at short range. I would rather face whole Hyde Parks of artillery than the ghastly forms of death which he has faced among the peaks and precipices of the mountains. There is probably no pleasure equal to the pleasure of climbing a dangerous Alp, but it is a pleasure which is confined strictly to people who can find pleasure in it. I have not jumped to this conclusion. I have traveled to it per gravel train, so to speak. I have thought the thing all out, and am quite sure I am right. A born climber's appetite for climbing is hard to satisfy. When it comes upon him, he is like a starving man with a feast before him. He may have other business on hand, but it must wait. Mr. Girdlestone had had his usual summer holiday in the Alps, and had spent it in his usual way, hunting for unique chances to break his neck. His vacation was over, and his luggage packed for England, but all of a sudden a hunger had come upon him to climb the tremendous Weisshorn once more, for he had heard of a new and utterly impossible route up it. His baggage was unpacked at once, and now he and a friend, laden with knapsacks, ice axes, coils of rope, and canteens of milk, were just setting out. They would spend the night high up among the snows somewhere, and get up at 2 in the morning and finish the enterprise. I had a strong desire to go with them, but forced it down, a feat which Mr. Girdlestone, with all his fortitude, could not do. Even ladies, catching the climbing mania, are unable to throw it off. A famous climber of that sex had attempted the Weisshorn a few days before our arrival, and she and her guides had lost their way in a snowstorm high up among the peaks and glaciers, and been forced to wander around a good while before they could find a way down. When this lady reached the bottom, she had been on her feet 23 hours. Our guides, hired on the Gemi, were already at Zermatt when we reached there, so there was nothing to interfere with our getting up an adventure whenever we should choose the time and the object. I resolved to devote my first evening in Zermatt to studying up the subject of alpine climbing by way of preparation. I read several books, and here are some of the things I found out. One's shoes must be strong and heavy and have pointed hobnails in them. The alpenstock must be of the best wood, for if it should break, loss of life might be the result. One should carry an axe to cut steps in the ice with on the great heights. There must be a ladder, for there are steep bits of rock which can be surmounted with this instrument or this utensil, but could not be surmounted without it. Such an obstruction has compelled the tourist to waste hours hunting another route, when a ladder would have saved him all trouble. One must have from 150 to 500 feet of strong rope to be used in lowering the party down steep declivities, which are too steep and smooth to be traversed in any other way. One must have a steel hook on another rope, a very useful thing, for when one is ascending and comes to a low bluff which is yet too high for the ladder, he swings this rope aloft like a lasso, the hook catches at the top of the bluff, and then the tourist climbs the rope hand over hand, being always particular to try and forget that if the hook gives way, he will never stop falling till he arrives in some part of Switzerland where they are not expecting him. Another important thing, there must be a rope to tie the whole party together with, so that if one falls from a mountain or down a bottomless chasm in a glacier, the other may brace back on the rope and save him. One must have a silk veil to protect his face from snow, sleet, hail, and gale, and colored goggles to protect his eyes from that dangerous enemy, snow-blindness. Finally, there must be some porters to carry provisions, wine, and scientific instruments, and also blanket bags for the party to sleep in. I closed my readings with a fearful adventure which Mr. Whymper once had on the Matterhorn when he was prowling around alone, 5,000 feet above the town of Breil. He was edging his way gingerly around the corner of a precipice where the upper edge of a sharp declivity of ice-glazed snow joined it. This declivity swept down a couple of 100 feet into a gully which curved around and ended at a precipice 800 feet high, overlooking a glacier. His foot slipped, and he fell. He says, "My knapsack brought my head down first, and I pitched into some rocks about a dozen feet below. They caught something and tumbled me off the edge, head over heels, into the gully. The baton was dashed from my hands, and I whirled downwards in a series of bounds, each longer than the last, now over ice, now into rocks, striking my head 4 or 5 times, each time with increased force. The last bound sent me spinning through the air in a leap of 50 or 60 feet, from one side of the gully to the other, and I struck the rocks, luckily, with the whole of my left side. They caught my clothes for a moment, and I fell back onto the snow with motion arrested. My head, fortunately, came the right side up, and a few frantic catches brought me to a halt in the neck of the gully and on the verge of the precipice. Baton, hat, and veil skimmed by and disappeared, and the crash of the rocks, which I had started as they fell onto the glacier, told how narrow had been the escape from utter destruction. As it was, I fell nearly 200 feet in 7 or 8 bounds. 10 feet more would have taken me in one gigantic leap of 800 feet onto the glacier below. The situation was sufficiently serious. The rocks could not be let go for a moment, and the blood was spurting out of more than 20 cuts. The most serious ones were in the head, and I vainly tried to close them with one hand whilst holding on with the other. It was useless. The blood gushed out in blinding jets at each pulsation. At last, in a moment of inspiration, I kicked out a big lump of snow and stuck it as plaster on my head. The idea was a happy one, and the flow of blood diminished. Then, scrambling up, I got, not a moment too soon, to a place of safety, and fainted away. The sun was setting when consciousness returned, and it was pitch dark before the great staircase was descended, but by a combination of luck and care, the whole 4,700 feet of descent to Brile was accomplished without a slip or once missing the way. His wounds kept him abed some days, then he got up and climbed that mountain again. This is the way with a true Alp climber. The more fun he has, the more he wants. Chapter 37. After I had finished my readings, I was no longer myself. I was tranced, uplifted, intoxicated by the almost incredible perils and adventures I had been following my authors through, and the triumphs I had been sharing with them. I sat silent some time, then turned to Harris and said, "My mind is made up." Something in my tone struck him, and when he glanced at my eye and read what was written there, his face paled perceptibly. He hesitated a moment, then said, "Speak." I answered with perfect calmness, "I will ascend the Riffelberg." If I had shot my poor friend, he could not have fallen from his chair more suddenly. If I had been his father, he could not have pleaded harder to get me to give up my purpose. But I turned a deaf ear to all he said. When he perceived at last that nothing could alter my determination, he ceased to urge, and for a while the deep silence was broken only by his sobs. I sat in marble resolution, with my eyes fixed upon vacancy, for in spirit I was already wrestling with the perils of the mountains, and my friend sat gazing at me in adoring admiration through his tears. At last he threw himself upon me in a loving embrace and exclaimed in broken tones, "Your Harris will never desert you. We will die together." I cheered the noble fellow with praises, and soon his fears were forgotten, and he was eager for the adventure. He wanted to summon the guides at once and leave at 2 in the morning, as he supposed the custom was. But I explained that nobody was looking at that hour, and that the start in the dark was not usually made from the village, but from the first night's resting place on the mountainside. I said we would leave the village at 3 or 4 p.m. on the morrow. Meantime, he could notify the guides, and also let the public know of the attempt which we proposed to make. I went to bed, but not to sleep. No man can sleep when he is about to undertake one of these alpine exploits. I tossed feverishly all night long, and was glad enough when I heard the clock strike 11:30 and knew it was time to get up for dinner. I rose, jaded and rusty, and went to the noon meal, where I found myself the center of interest and curiosity, for the news was already abroad. It is not easy to eat calmly when you are a lion, but it is very pleasant, nevertheless. As usual at Zermatt, when a great ascent is about to be undertaken, everybody, native and foreign, laid aside his own projects and took up a good position to observe the start. The expedition consisted of 198 persons, including the mules, or 205, including the cows. as follows: Chiefs of service, myself, Mr. Harris, 17 guides, 4 surgeons, 1 geologist, 1 botanist, 3 chaplains, 2 draftsmen, 15 barkeepers, 1 Latinist. Subordinates: 1 veterinary surgeon, 1 butler, 12 waiters, 1 footman, 1 barber, 1 head cook, 9 assistants, 4 pastry cooks, 1 confectionery artist. Transportation, etc. 27 porters, 44 mules, 44 muleteers, 3 coarse washers and ironers, 1 fine, ditto, 7 cows, 2 milkers. Total 154 men, 51 animals, grand total 205.